Today we're learning Siman Peva Halacha Yud, and the Shulchan Aruch says as follows: Ein Merkam Beis Beitas Nevel Utrefel Over Chum. A person is not allowed to sell an egg that was in the veil or trefer, which we saw that those eggs are not kosher. You're not allowed to sell to someone who's not Jewish. Why? Shem Yachzav Yimkrim Yisrael. Maybe he'll go ahead and sell it to a Jew. We've spoken before about a chashash takala, that if he would resell, we're concerned that he might resell the egg to a Jew, that person would have no way of knowing that it came from an available trefer, and therefore to sell it to the non-Jew is not responsible because it may end up that the Jew will end up eating it. Casey acid. So what should I do with this egg? I have this egg which is from an available trefer. It's not kosher. So what should I do? You should fend a bakara. You should crack it and beat it in a bowl, and then sell it to someone who's not Jewish. Because then no Yid will buy from him afterwards. And we're going to talk later about today we're going to speak about why is it that nobody will buy from him, but nobody will buy from him, so you're safe. You crack it, and Shulchan Aruch says beat it. That may be a requirement, but we'll talk about cracking the egg. You crack the egg, and therefore nobody will buy it. Now, the Shulchan Aruch continues. This that we said, that a Jew is not allowed to buy an egg that's already cracked from someone who's not Jewish, that's talking about that the egg is, he came, when he sees the non-Jew, he has the cracked egg. Then we have to be concerned that maybe a Jew sold to them because of exactly this reason, because he wanted to be, that's why he sold to them. You're allowed to buy bread made with eggs smeared on top of them. That's a side point that we saw in some Kufi Beis, or those who hold you can't buy bread made by a non-Jew because of Israel Pas Akum or Pas Palter. So he said, assuming you don't have that problem, you can buy bread that has egg on top of it. You're not seeing the egg cracked in the guy's hand, and therefore you're just seeing. Now, of course, if you have egg on top of bread, that means that the egg was cracked. He didn't put a whole egg on top there, so the egg was cracked. Even though you're not allowed to buy a whole egg, an egg that's cracked from someone who's not Jewish, you're allowed to buy a food product that has in it egg that was cracked. I'm going to see why soon. The Ramah says, some say now that we eat paspalter, that's the Ramah sheet, that we eat paspalter, so then they are asura, afil trufa. Now you can't. Now the fact that this second part of the Shulchan Aruch that said you could eat the bread with the egg on it undermines the first part, because the first part says we could sell the cracked eggs because no one will buy from him, but now people will buy from him. So the Ramah says some people say that therefore you can't. We lost that hefter from the beginning of selling them cracked eggs. The Kashrus Shem Yarven Pasi. So maybe he's going to use it in bread. What else will he do with a cracked egg? So therefore, we've now lost our first hefter. So that's the mimic. The Malcolm Denogan Lasses Hapasim Deim, in places where, in fact, the bakers use eggs in their recipes, the Noigim by Hetel, and also the people who pass Palter, Abasham comes in but otherwise you're allowed to eat it. Okay. So, we saw at the very beginning of the Simon that the original din, Migin HaGemara, was that a person is not allowed to eat eggs. A person cannot allow to eat an egg from someone who's not Jewish unless there were all kinds of proofs that this came from a kosher bird. Otherwise, he has no right to assume that he's getting a kosher egg. But that nowadays, that changed because the overwhelming majority of eggs sold in the market are all from kosher birds, from chickens and ducks and geese, and we saw like that. And therefore, a person is allowed to buy any egg that he wants in the market. But the Gemara says, back in the Dili Gemara, the Gemara says exactly what it said in our Shulchan Aruch. If you have the egg, which is a trefer, and the egg is not kosher, what should you do with it? So the Gemara says this: you crack it, and before you give it to the non-Jew, and therefore no one will buy it. Now, the words of that Gemara are as follows. This is the way our wording of our Gemara says as follows: you can't sell an egg that came from a bird who was a trefer to someone who's not Jewish. Unless we had first cracked it and beat it in a bowl. Therefore, we can't buy eggs from. You can't buy cracked eggs from non-Jews. So the question we want to think about is, what did we gain What was the point of cracking the egg? What's the reason why the Gemara says if you crack it, then it's okay? Why is cracking different than a non-cracked egg? So if we read the Gemara as we have it, with the word lafika in that Gemara, then it reads as follows. Really, you can't sell eggs to non-Jews. An egg that's traded, you can't sell it to someone who's not Jewish. He might resell it to somebody else, and that person will buy it. So now we have a problem, because anybody who owns an egg that's a treifa, what's he supposed to do with it? So he can, I guess, throw it in the garbage, but Chazal wanted to give him an out. They wanted to give him a way to be able to sell his not kosher egg. Lafika. Therefore, since we can't sell eggs, the first one, since we can't sell eggs to non-Jews, because an egg that's a treifa to non-Jews, Lafika. Therefore, since we can't do that, Chazal want to help us, so they instituted that people should not buy cracked eggs from non-Jews, and once we have that rule, you can't buy cracked eggs from them, now we have an out. Now we have a way to get rid of our eggs. Because now I'll just take advantage and I'll crack my egg before I sell them. So the Lafika, 3 times, that's what Chazal said that you should do Lafika. And since they did that, therefore, you can't buy cracked eggs, so which gives a little bit of an impression that there was nothing inherently wrong with buying a cracked egg. But it was a made-up, so to speak, a made-up thing by Chazal in order to give us an out, a way to get rid of our cracked eggs. Now, that's how we might have read the Gemara as is. But the Rif and the Rosh Korah Gemara, they don't say more, they just quote the words of the Gemara, at least on this part. The Rambam sounds differently, the way he brings it around. First Rambam says, you should know this is what it takes to make a kosher egg. Then he says, this is what makes a bird kosher. And this is how you know if an egg is kosher. Like the siman or brown and things like that, how you know if an egg is kosher. And then he talks about how you know when you can trust someone that they're getting a kosher egg. After that, he says, therefore, now I've told you all those things, he says, you can't buy eggs from a guy unless it meets all kinds of kosher species. Okay, that's the earlier. He says, and then you don't have to ever worry about that eggs come from the Beilu Trefa. And he says, don't buy a cracked egg from a non-Jew. Okay, so that sounds like, what is that fitting in over here? Sounds like the reason why you can't buy the cracked egg is because if you buy a cracked egg, you won't be able to prove that it's kosher. You might, if you have a whole egg, you can use what he spoke about earlier, the identification to know if this is a kosher egg. But in a cracked egg, you won't know. So according to the Rambam, it sounds like inherently you're not allowed to buy cracked eggs, because in cracked eggs you won't be able to know whether it's from a kosher bird or not. And now Chazal used that information to not give you, now it's like sort of automatically, you want to know what to do with your egg that's a treifa, egg from a treifa? No problem. Crack it and give it to them, because no Hebrew will ever buy it like that. So the way the Rambam was saying it, the Isser to buy cracked eggs came before the idea to crack eggs when you want to get rid of them to a guy. As opposed to the way we were reading the Gemara, the Isser to buy cracked eggs is after the Gemara. The Gemara said, I want to find a way for people to get rid of their cracked eggs. So we said, okay, let's make it Isser to buy cracked eggs. Okay. So if we were to stay like that, if we look now in the Turn Shulchan Aruch, when they bring the din, they say, if you have an egg from a treifa, you can crack it and give it to a guy, because nobody will buy from it. Okay, one of the words is or nobody would buy an egg like that. As if that's understood as like partial. Of course, nobody would buy that kind of an egg. Not that the buying egg is a result of the din. The buying egg precedes the din. Of course, nobody would buy a cracked egg from someone who's not Jewish, and therefore, that's the reason for the din. Sound like the way the Rambam said it. Now, seemingly, there's a big nafkamina between these two ways of understanding it. Okay, and that is, we saw, as I mentioned earlier, we know that nowadays we're allowed to buy eggs from Goyim. We don't have to be concerned that it comes from a non-kosher bird. We're allowed to buy any egg. We don't have to follow those rules that the Gemara said of how you determine if an egg is kosher. So that means it's like this. According to the way we had been reading the Gemara, Chazal made a special rule. You're not allowed to buy cracked eggs. Why did they make that rule? Just as a way to give people an out of how to get rid of their eggs that are from treifas. But they made such a rule. They said you're not allowed to buy. It wasn't based on whether the egg is treif. They made the rule in order to let people have a way to get rid of their eggs that are treifas. So if that's the rule, if so, that rule applies no matter what. The rule is the rule. But according to the Rambam, the reason why nobody would buy cracked eggs, why you wouldn't buy cracked eggs, is because they're concerned maybe it comes from a treif bird. Well, nowadays, that's not a concern. We don't have any worry that nowadays our eggs might come from a trait bird. We're allowed to buy eggs anybody. Right? We don't have to follow any rules when we buy an egg. So therefore, according to the Rambam, it would be perfectly fine to buy cracked. Nowadays, it should be perfectly fine to buy cracked eggs from a guy. Okay? So, that's what it would seem like. In fact, if we look in the Beis Yosef, the Beis Yosef brings a shayla from Rabbeinu Yerucham. And Rabbeinu Yerucham says like this. He says, nowadays, that we're allowed to buy eggs from Goyim and assume that they're kosher. We're allowed to do that nowadays. In Cain, are you still usher to buy a cracked egg from a guy? Should we say that it's mutter? The mutter is the easy way. Should we say that it's mutter to buy the cracked eggs from a guy because we know the egg is kosher, so what's the problem? Or he says maybe you should not be allowed to buy it. He doesn't explain what the tzarech l'hachmir. What's the reason to be machmir? Why shouldn't you buy the cracked egg from the guy? Well, it could be wrong. If the reason why I don't buy cracked eggs is because they might be from a non-kosher species. Well, we don't worry about the non-kosher species anymore. So he doesn't say what it is. All he says is cryptically. He says maybe it depends on different gear stories in the Gemara. Okay? He doesn't tell what those different gear stories might be or what the shayla is going to do. Maybe it depends on different gear stories. Could it be? Maybe it has to do with you have that word lefikach in the Gemara. I told you that the reason to think that there's an independent isser, chazam makes a special isser, is because the way the Gemara says the word lefikach. Maybe others don't have that word lefikach. Again, the Rif and the Rosh do. Maybe, according to those who are machmir, they don't have the word lefika. I don't know. I mean, we know that the Torah and the Beis Yosef didn't bring those kind of words. That doesn't mean they didn't have the girsa. They didn't know Sha'az and nobody would buy it. And the Shulchan Aruch takes the tzar l'hachmir of what Rabbeinu Yerucham said. As we saw, even nowadays, when we're not allowed, when we're allowed to buy eggs from anybody, that we saw in the beginning of this, and we're allowed to buy eggs from anybody. Even so, you're not allowed to buy cracked eggs from a guy. Okay. But with that explanation for why that should be true, why is it that if the whole reason why we couldn't buy cracked eggs originally, why that started off was because if we buy a cracked egg, it might be from a trait bird. So why can't I buy cracked eggs from a bird? So, in order to answer that, we may find an answer in a different part of our day, and that is as follows. The Rajba in Terz Bayis, he says that what I mentioned, that you could buy eggs nowadays from everybody. You're allowed to buy eggs from everybody because you can assume they come from a kosher bird. So he says, but you're not allowed to buy cracked eggs. And this is what he says, why you're not allowed to buy cracked eggs. He says, Shechazusa muchachas alehem. The way they look indicates, Shamachma shechoyu asuris tar from Yisrael and Machmalai. The fact that it's a cracked egg tells us that there's something strange about this egg. Why in the world is this guy selling an egg that's already cracked? People don't usually sell cracked eggs. Why is he selling a cracked egg? So he says, it must be that the reason why he's selling a cracked egg is because something's wrong. And we know what's wrong. What's wrong is the egg came from a bird that was a treifa. A yid had that, and he knows the Gemara says when you have eggs from a bird that's a treifa, what you need to do is you crack it before you sell it to the guy. So the fact that it's cracked, we're not here worried that it might be from a bird that's a non-kosher species. But what we're really concerned is that something's fishy going on over here. The fact that that's cracked, it's a reisa. The reisa that comes because of the fact that it's cracked tells us that maybe it comes from a bird which was a treifa, and that's why he has a cracked egg, just like the Gemara says. Okay, so that would help us explain Rabbeinu Yerucham and what the Shulchan Aruch said. That we know that birds, the eggs nowadays are from kosher species. That's not our concern. We don't worry that it maybe comes from a non-kosher species. However, why on earth is my neighbor trying to sell me a cracked egg? Whoever went and bought a cracked egg? So if he's selling me a cracked egg, that makes me suspect that it's something strange. And the suspicion that we have is, at least what we talk about here, is the writer's suspicion is it came from someone of an egg from a bird that was a treifa, and he cracked it as a way to get rid of it. Okay, so now, what would happen? What would happen if I have a cracked, now according to the way the Rajba said, what happens if I have a cracked egg that has no reisa? I have a cracked egg that there's nothing strange about the fact that it's cracked. So, then this should be okay. Then there shouldn't be any problem buying today. And in fact, that's the next words in the Rajba. After the Rajba tells us that the reason why we can't buy cracked eggs is because there's a reis on them. It looks odd that they're cracked. He says, and the next thing he says is, if a person wants to buy bread with eggs smeared on top of it, that's okay. And that's very logical. It flows from what he just said. The whole reason we can't buy a cracked egg is because of a reisa. Well, there's no reisa when the egg was cracked to make it on the bread. That's not strange. There's nothing unusual about that. If so, there's no razor. If there's no razor, I'm allowed to buy bread with eggs on top of it. Why not? It's a cracked egg. We know the egg comes from a kosher species, like every other egg we buy. And the fact that it's cracked is not a razor. There's no problem. I'm allowed to buy that crack, the egg that's on the bread, and as we saw, the Shulchan Aruch brings that. The Shulchan Aruch brought this in, and in the Rashba, it's a flow. After I tell you that nowadays, the only reason you can't buy cracked eggs is because it's a razor. It's odd that the egg is cracked. So now, what flows from that is, if there's no razor, I'm allowed to buy the egg, so I can buy the bread that has egg on top of it. Okay? So we nowadays, of course, that what the Shulchan Aruch said is true. We have an even more specific case of that, which is, in fact, nowadays lots of manufacturers, bakers, caterers buy cracked eggs. We call them liquid eggs, which is to say, there are companies that they spend all day long cracking eggs, turning them and liquefying them, either selling them as yellow or whole eggs or just the white of the eggs, and they sell them to caterers and manufacturers who want to use them. Instead of cracking eggs themselves, they buy pre-cracked eggs. So that case, if you open up just the Shulchan Aruch the way we have it, it says a person is not allowed to buy a cracked egg. In the case, the Shulchan Aruch says, except by the bread, because there it's not whole, it's not just an egg, it's egg on bread. If you read the Shulchan Aruch, what would you say? Have just a cracked egg, I'm not allowed to buy it. The caterer can't use it. But now we understand that the din is, it's not because it's cracked per se. It's that it looks strange that a person has a cracked egg. There's a razor. Why is someone selling me a cracked egg? Well, in the case of a liquid egg company, that's not strange. There's no razor to the fact that this egg is cracked. That's their business, is they crack eggs for people. They crack eggs for people and they sell them cracked eggs. So there's no razor at all. And therefore, it would be according to what we're saying from the Rashba, and which is sort of what the Shulchan Aruch recorded. It's perfectly fine to buy the liquid eggs. You do not have to be concerned for this, what it says in our Shulchan Aruch that said that a cracked egg, you're not allowed to buy cracked eggs from a guy. Now, on the other hand, at the same time, we have to say there's a little bit of a problem. And that is, I've told you the sheet of the Rashba that you only can't buy eggs when there's liquid eggs or cracked eggs when there's a razor. But the Maggid Mishnah, on that in the Rambam, says, he brings this Rashba, that there's only a problem when there's a razor. But then he says the following. He says, I have another reason to explain why you're not allowed to buy liquid cracked eggs. Not just because of the razor. I'm only allowed to buy eggs from chickens and ducks. He says this, that, eating a cracked egg is really along the lines of what the Rambam said. Which is to say, the Rambam had just told us, had said that you're not allowed to buy eggs unless you can recognize there's all kinds of rules of how you decide whether an egg is kosher. Now, those rules don't apply in the same way nowadays as they used to. But even so, a person needs to still have what he calls a tfiyas ayin. He still has to have some recognition, process of recognition that this is a kosher bird, a kosher egg. That is to say, the reason why he holds you're not allowed to buy a cracked egg is because when I buy a whole chicken egg, when I go to the store and I buy a tray of eggs, I look at the eggs, they all look like regular chicken eggs to me. So, in addition to the roy that I have, that most eggs nowadays, the vast majority come from kosher birds, I also look at the egg, and to me, it looks like a regular egg, like I'm expecting to see. That look and that check of the egg is the last thing I need to prove to me and make the egg mutter to me. But when I have a cracked egg, I have the roy. I know that most eggs are coming from kosher birds. But I'm missing on that part of looking at the egg and saying, this looks like a kosher egg to me. Because, of course, once it's cracked, there's no way to tell what bird it came from. It just looks like an egg. So the Maggid Mishnah is saying is that there's an extra reason why you can't buy an egg that's cracked. It's not because of the reyes reason. It's because there's a different reason. And that reason is that I'm missing a piece of proof. Some of the proof that I would have in a regular egg is the way it looks like a normal regular egg. That's what the Maggid Mishnah says. According to the Maggid Mishnah, it would seem, you're not allowed to buy liquid eggs nowadays, just like we could in the times of the Gemara. In fact, the Prim Government says that. He says the Maggid Mishnah is arguing on the Rashba exactly on this part. And the Maggid Mishnah holds you're not allowed to eat a cracked egg from a guy, even if there's no razor. The Rashba will be making whether there is a razor, but the Maggid Mishnah will not be making even if there's no razor. Now, the Prim Government also tells us that the Taz thinks that there's a different Rambam. not an art in a different din. He thinks that there's because Ramah in different, in a different din, that might hold like this Maggid Mishnah. Okay, the Shach says it's not true. The Ramah doesn't mean it, but the Taz at a certain point thinks that the Ramah holds like this Shita that you're not allowed to eat the cracked egg even if there's a razor. And the Taz asks him actually, he says, "What are you talking about? Well, then how come you're allowed to eat the egg that's on the bread? The egg that's on the bread is no razor. Okay, so that sort of like proves that if you hold up this shita, you wouldn't allow egg on bread. And the Taz therefore answers a question on what he thinks is the shita of the Ramah, and he therefore argues on what he thinks would have been that shita of the Ramah. Okay, but it just makes the point that the Pri Megadim makes this point that the Maggid Mishnah and the Rashba are disagreeing with each other. The Rashba holds that if there's no razor, you're allowed to eat the cracked egg, and the Maggid Mishnah holds you're not allowed to eat the cracked egg. You're not allowed to eat the cracked egg even if there's no razor. Okay, now that definitely seems like what the Maggid Mishnah is saying. The Pri Megadim, reads very smoothly. There's only one problem. Okay, and the problem is that the Maggid Mishnah said brings the Rashba who says the problem is because of razor. There's actually I have another possible reason, that the reason is because you don't get to see the egg and you're missing out on that. Okay? And what's the next words in the Maggid Mishnah? He says, let's go back to the Rashba, and the Rashba says you're allowed to eat egg on bread. Because in that case, that's fine, you're allowed to eat egg on bread. Well, what just happened? If his other reason was arguing on the Rashba, how can he quote the second half of the Rashba without telling that he disagrees about that? As we said, the egg on the bread is an extension of what the Rashba said. The Rashba said the only reason why you can't eat egg on bread, you can't eat cracked egg, is because there's a reisa. Therefore, if I have a case where there's no reisa, like the egg on the bread, then I'm allowed to eat it. Well, if the Maggid Mishnah is arguing on the reason and saying no, even if there's no reisa, you're not allowed to eat it, so why not eat the egg on the bread? Well, why doesn't he tell us that he disagrees with that? How can he bring the first part of the Rashba, argue on it, but yet bring the second part and be happily accepted? There's something seems missing over here. Okay, the same thing you see in Teres Chatas, who also, he brings the Maggid Mishnah, even by name, he brings the Maggid Mishnah in Teres Chatas and says that the reason why you can't eat it is because you don't get to see the whole egg. But then you turn the pages in Siman Samach Vav, we turn to Siman Samach Zayin, literally turn the page in the document, in the Teres Chatas, you turn the page, and in Siman Samach Zayin, the Ramah, the Teres Chatas says, and you can eat egg on bread, that's fine, no problem, you're allowed to eat egg that's on the bread. Well, so what's going on? If Maggid Mishnah doesn't allow you to eat egg on the bread, so why all of a sudden, how come Maggid Mishnah lets you, and how come the document Teres Chatas says, you're allowed to eat egg on the bread? What's happening over here? And it's sort of like the Kashrus from before here, okay? A little bit. So, I don't really know the answer. And maybe the answer is when the Maggid Mishnah said, I have a Tamach here, he said the Tam Achi actually, he didn't mean like the Pri Megadim that it's a Tam Achi to argue, but it's a secondary thing. Which is, there's another point, which is when we have a liquid egg, not only is there a reisa, but there's also missing in us being able to identify the egg. What would happen if there's no reisa, but I still can't identify the egg? It could be the Maggid Mishnah wouldn't have argued. Maybe the Maggid Mishnah just means it as there's an extra piece, there's another sniff here, that there's another thing you can't recognize the egg. But if we're missing that, if that's the only thing, then that's not enough. Maybe that's what he meant. Again, the Pri Megadim did not understand that. That's not the simple reading of what he said. Maybe that's the pshat. Okay, regardless, if it is or is not the pshat, everyone says that the din is, like we saw again in the Siman, like the Maggid Mishnah says himself, that you're laying the egg on the bread. Seemingly, that's in line with the Rashba's Kula, that when there's no reisa, then you're allowed to eat it. And either that we're arguing on the Maggid Mishnah, or the Maggid Mishnah somehow agrees to that anyhow. But in the end, we therefore, following this line of reasoning of the Rashba, we theoretically cannot eat eggs anymore, like Rabbi Yerucham said, we cannot eat cracked eggs anymore because there's a reisa. Why? Because it's a reisa. But in cases when there's no reisa, in cases when we like a liquid eggs you have nowadays, or eggs on bread, where there's no reisa, then it's okay to eat them, and they are mutter.